Welcome to another human-read audiobook by the United Marxist Pact Discord server, link below in the description. In this series, we continue our investigation into the initial construction, the organizational structure, and the principles and tactics of the form of worker organization capable of seizing political power and establishing the revolutionary proletarian dictatorship and communality, which can in turn produce the communist mode of production through the shared class interests of the workers of the entire world. Our goal is to compile, analyze, and elaborate on what all these texts have to say about this. At the end, have a strong understanding of the exact scientific process of it, particularly in general terms. At the end of our readings as a whole, we will try to put it all together and present it as a coherent whole in an educational video with associated notations. Today's reading will be the 1951 ICP Characteristic Theses of the Party. We have a pre-written textual analysis on the terms of the aforementioned topics, which was also posted in the pinned comment if you prefer to read in text, or follow the link in the description to a read-only version of my Google Docs notes. This will summarize the contents of the text, but is no replacement for the actual reading itself for the sake of understanding the context and content of the piece. In addition, in the reading, I supply my own commentary, critiques, additions, etc., which may be helpful for understanding some particularities. And I do not actually write down things that are repetitious or I feel are completely inapplicable. So let's get right into the textual analysis from my point of view. The class party is made up of the most advanced and resolute parts of the proletariat which arise from the development of theory and class struggle, who then seek to maintain and make predictions from that theory in order to educate and unite the masses' individual interests into a general struggle. Through preparations, it gathers the material means, weapons, supply, etc., for action experience and leads the working class as its general staff while creating international unity of the communist movement. It's all stuff that we have talked about many times before. As time has passed, the bourgeois system has built up its own tactics and methods of resistance against proletarian class struggle and its organizations. The most dangerous form that has arisen has been through recuperation and presentation of options of class collaboration to sections of the proletariat. So this would be fascism, social democracy, national liberation from the wherein, hey, join us and we will become the capitalists in our own nations, right? Therefore, the party needs to struggle directly against people calling for reformism, with even reformist positions rejected for agitational purposes. Reject any alliances with the middle classes or reformist organizations which can only weaken it and the proletariat's positions. It as in the party. In order to carry out its tasks in modern times, the party must transcend national boundaries and become an international party, producing an international. This party must be autonomous and independent from any organized political or military power while defending, developing itself, and educating others about the movement. Its inner organization should be girded by the propagation of the communist theory and program, along with activity alongside the masses struggling for their immediate interests. The party itself is a minority of the working class that has mastered revolutionary tactics in theory and practice, understanding the general objectives of the proletariat and the historical movement internationally. Such a knowledge can never be held by any individual or even a small collection of workers. Rather, the party's general knowledge rests in the whole of its activities. In order to tap into and utilize such knowledge, there needs to be an organic unity of the whole party. It is unitary in doctrine and action, and leaders and followers in the party have discipline and obligations, while the party itself does not have compulsory, either physically or socially, participation. It focuses on the recruitment of revolutionary youth and their education and preparation for political activity, demanding lack of personal ambition or personality cult, while being able to uphold continuity and revolutionary tradition. Under certain circumstances, while the party might not ally with the middle class's organizations, it might seek alliance in other areas. The conditions wherein this occurs are informed on a historical basis, which determines the party's strategy and tactics, but under no circumstances can the party abandon its principles. Functionally, The international proletariat must be developed, and anything that hinders such development of the class struggle is anti Marxist. Hence, reformist electoral demands of all kinds abandon the class struggle regardless of their intentions, and thereby electoral coalitions are abandoned by revolutionary communists. No bourgeois legality should be respected, and the need for insurrection, even when alternatives are presented by the bourgeoisie and opportunist factions, must be recognized and sought at all times. Despite this, the party still takes part in all local and economic struggles. Any reduction in the independence and autonomy of the party is at all times viciously rejected, including, for example, any configuration of the United Front, which calls on the party to make any sort of sacrifice in those terms. In addition, revolutionary communists must always practice revolutionary defeatism if they are within imperialist countries, and turn economic imperialist war into political civil war, refusing alliance with governments at war, even when the imperialists declare they are defending themselves. This must be accompanied by an active fight for decolonialism and national liberation, supporting armed resistances by all forces fighting against uh, colonization and against national liberation, including, for example, with Black Americans fighting white capitalist metropolis. At all times, it seeks to take the offensive and aims for attack and conquest of political power, staunchly refusing any forms of calls to quote return to previous or new quote better form of capitalism. The party, no matter the circumstances forced by the bourgeoisie in their response to proletarian class struggle, expects no mercy and prepares only for the revolutionary civil war. Any opportunism or gradualism weakens the party's capacity to actually resist when the hammer inevitably comes down. The party at any and all times should reject any calls for peaceful coexistence, propagandizing about the incompatibility among classes and the realities and necessities of class struggle, which makes any form of pacifism impossible. Armed struggle and insurrection should at all times be prepared for. The proletariat and their party must accept this in order to be capable of engaging in class struggle. Any calls for pacifism, while imperialism and the bourgeoisie exist, can only ever be aimed at disarming the proletariat and removing their capacity for revolutionary influence. Hence, the party should maintain the historical line of preparation for resurgence of international class struggle, reject any calls for peaceful coexistence, and prepare theoretically and materially. This requires the integration of all results of past experiences, and while objective and subjective conditions are undeveloped and practical activity are reduced, the final goal, which produces the ability to take advantage of inevitable development of subjective conditions, must always be kept in focus, with tactics employed which reach towards that in a dynamic way. Regardless of objective conditions, the proletariat's doctrine is unchanging because its role in the historical dialect, and therefore the proletariat's movement, should not have any revisions towards principles of any kind of the proletarian revolution. With this historic understanding, the party is able to and should analyze contemporary social phenomena scientifically and use that to prove to the proletariat its correct position. Due to the form of reaction bourgeois society has adopted, that of quote peaceful coexistence and class collaboration, the party's targets must be the opportunist quote communist parties in order to re-centralize the proletariat on the correct line and produce a rigorous Marxist movement. In addition, the party currently lacks links with the masses, and so it should not seek to develop new theories or renovate old ones, as it cannot put them into testing via praxis, and any attempts to do so will only lead to incorrect stances developing atop incorrect stances. The proletariat needs the party to maintain theoretical continuity as the condensation of experiences of past struggles until conditions allow it to take action. In this time, the party aims principally at propaganda explaining the correct political line and principles of revolutionary movement, which should penetrate and place itself among the masses at periods of historical crisis of capital. This penetration, done by attacking the opportunist parties, includes entryism and coalition with those parties or organizations with the pretext of extending our reach. This is good, as our tactics to get the proletariat to listen cannot breach our principles, else it confuses the proletariat and weakens the position of the party, which is only fit to carry out the struggle if it has the correct doctrine and political stance, which thereby precludes expedients that lead to deviation from principle. Attempts for coalition or entryism or committee formation with non proletarian organizations are, of course, and also obvious fool's errands which only harms the party. However, unlike other political organizations, the party is willing to work with unions and other economic organizations that can be present and grow influence within, which have voluntary membership, non sectarianism in terms of politics, religion, or social opinions, and thereby not exclude all possibilities of autonomous class action, and which are entirely proletarian. The party helps develop economic associations which accept its principles and leadership, and ones that do not. It builds a network of communist cells, groups, and factions within it in an attempt to take them over from within. The party pushes for all such organizations to seek interconnection with all other economic associations and remain fully open. Okay, I will now begin the full audiobook reading. It will explain why I went through that, and I take my notes as I read. So I hope that you will stick around. Let's get started. This is the 1951 International Communist Party Characteristic Theses of the Party. Produced at a party meeting held in Florence, 8 to 9 December 1951 by the International Communist Party. I just repeated myself multiple times over. This is split into 4 sections. Part 1, Theory. Part 2, Tasks of the Communist Party. Part 3, Historical Waves of Opportunist Degeneration, with subsections A. Opportunism at the end of the 19th century, B. Opportunism in 1914, and C. Opportunism after 1926. And then section 4, Party Action. Let's get started. Part 1, Theory. The doctrine of the party is founded on the principles of the historical materialism of the critical communism set out by Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto, in the Capital, and other fundamental works in which formed the basis of the Communist International constituted in 1919 and of the Italian Communist Party founded at Leghorn in 1921, section of the Communist International. 1. In the present capitalist social regime, an ever-increasing contrast between productive forces and productive relations is developing. This contrast reveals itself in the opposing interests and the class struggle between the proletariat and the ruling bourgeoisie. So, number 1, the party is based on class struggle. 2. The present productive relations are protected by the bourgeois state. Even when democratic elections are used and whatever the form of the representative system may be, is always the exclusive organ of the capitalist class. In other words, we can't go through democratic means because, the king won't give up his crown just because people ask him to. In addition, the state itself is our enemy. It's not something that we can wield of our own. We must destroy the bourgeois state and produce our own. 3. The proletariat cannot crush or modify the mechanism of capitalist production relations, source of its exploitation, without wrecking the bourgeois power through violence. That's repetition in my mind, but okay. Part 4. The class party is the indispensable organ for the proletarian revolutionary struggle. The Communist Party consists of the most advanced and resolute parts of the proletariat, unites the efforts of the working masses, transforming their struggles for group interests and contingent issues into the general struggle for the revolutionary emancipation of the proletariat, propagating the revolutionary theory among the masses, organizing the material means of action, that is like getting guns and stuff, and supplies, leading the working class all along its struggle by securing the historical continuity and international unity of the movement are duties of the party. We already have all this in previous things, but it's nice to have a repetition. 5. After it has knocked down the power of the capitalist state, the proletariat must completely destroy the old state apparatus in order to organize itself as a ruling class and set up its own dictatorship. It will deny all functions and political rights to any individual of the bourgeois class so long as they survive socially, founding the organs of the new regime exclusively on the productive class. Such is a program which the Communist Party sets itself and which is characteristic of it. It is a party alone which therefore represents, organizes, and directs the proletarian dictatorship. Yeah, okay, this is more dictatorship of the proletariat synonymous with the dictatorship of the class party. This is in question. We'll see if it is able to convince me at any point of this. Anyway, basically, the justification of this is essentially the party, the leadership, the proletariat, and the communality or dictatorship, and all become one. Right, the people all enter into the dictatorship of the proletariat as members of the state, which loses its political character, and basically everybody becomes a member of the state. And because the party is supposed to be the most developed thing through the democracy, the proletarian democracy, or at least whatever they have in mind, essentially the party enters into all the different positions within it because people just elect or select or however the process is members of the party to all positions. So it's really the same thing anyway. Continuing. The necessary defense of the proletarian state against all counter-revolutionary attempts can only be secured by taking from the bourgeoisie and from all the parties, enemies of proletarian dictatorship, any means of agitation and political propaganda, and by the proletariat's armed organization able to repulse all internal and external attacks. 6. I do wish that it would, explain what the contents of such a claim is, right? Anyway, 6. Only the force of the proletarian state will be able to put systematically into effect the necessary measures for intervening in the relations of the social economy, by means of which the collective management of production and distribution will take the place of the capitalist system. 7. This transformation of the economy and consequently the whole social life will lead to the gradual elimination of the necessity for a political state, which will progressively become an apparatus for the rational administration of human activities. I'm just going to add this to our bit on the dictatorship of the proletariat. Because remember, we also have stuff on the communist mode production and the dictatorship of the proletariat. Continuing. In the face of the capitalist world and workers' movement following the Second World War, the position of the party is founded on the following points. 8. In the course of the first half of the 20th century, the capitalist social system has been developing in the economic field by creating monopolistic trusts among the employers, by trying to control and manage production and exchanges according to control plans with state management of whole sectors of production. In the political field, there has been an increase of the police and army potential of the state, all governments adopting a more totalitarian form. All these are neither new sorts of social organizations as a transition from capitalism to socialism, nor revivals of pre-bourgeois political regimes. On the contrary, they are definite forms of a more and more direct and exclusive management of power and state by the most developed forces of capital. This course excludes the progressive, pacifist, and evolutionist interpretations of the becoming of the bourgeois regime, and confirms the prevision of the concentration and of the antagonistic arraying of the class forces. Proletariat, in order to confront its enemies' growing potential with strengthened revolutionary energy, must repel the illusory revival of democratic liberalism and constitutional guarantees. The party must not even accept this as a means of agitation, must historically get rid once and for all of the practice of alliances, even for transitory issues, with the middle class as well as the pseudo-proletarian and reformist parties. Okay, we'll add this. Need to break with these other groups. 9. The world imperialistic wars show that the crisis of disgregation of capitalism, disintegration, do they possibly mean? No. Okay. Separation of components from a whole, especially people from a company. The crisis of separation from the whole of capitalism is inevitable as it has entered the phase when its expansion, instead of signifying a continual increment, productive forces is conditioned by repeated and ever-growing destructions. These wars have caused repeated deep crises in the workers' world organization because the dominant classes can impose on them military and national solidarity with one or another of the belligerents. The only historical alternative is to say against such a situation is the awakening of the internal class struggle, till the civil war of the working masses to overthrow the power of all bourgeois states and of worker coalitions with the reconstitution of the International Communist Party as an autonomous force, independent of any organized military or political power. Okay. So it's saying because essentially inter-imperialist war has developed more and more, the need for revolutionary defeatism is higher, and we need to act a truly international force. 10. The proletarian state, being its apparatus and instrument and a weapon for the struggle in a transition historical period, does not draw its force from constitutional canons and representative systems. The most complete historical example of such a state is up to the present is that of the Soviets, workers' councils, which were created during the October 1917 Russian Revolution, when the working class armed itself under the leadership of the Bolshevik Party alone. During the totalitarian seizure of power, that's not necessarily a bad thing, to be clear. The wiping out of the Constituent Assembly and that's not on the grounds of anti-constitutionalism or anything like that. In fact, it was protecting the Constitution and is directly part of that. This is historical revisionism if it's presenting it on those terms. Anyway, the struggle to repulse the external attacks of the bourgeois government and to crush the internal rebellion of the defeated class, of middle and pay bourgeois strata and of opportunist parties, inevitable allies of the counter-revolution at the decisive moment. Okay, so it doesn't actually say what it wants. It just says that it's essentially that we can't rely on constitutions as the basis for the constitutions and representative systems as the basis for the proletarian state. And it does reference the 1917 Soviet Workers' Councils, which would it would be nice if it would explain that, but it's fair that it doesn't. 11. The integral realization of socialism within the limits of one country is inconceivable, and the socialist transformation cannot be carried out without failure and momentary setbacks. The defense of the proletarian regime against the ever present dangers of degeneration is possible only if the proletarian state is always coordinated with the international struggle of the working class of each country against its own bourgeoisie, its state, and its army. This struggle permits no respite even in wartime. This coordination can only be secured if the World Communist Party controls the politics and program of the states where the working class has been vanquished. No, sorry. And the program of the states where the working class has vanquished. That is to say, it's vanquished the states and it is established its own dictatorship. Okay. Uh, and basically, it's saying that we need revolutionary defeatism. We need an international organization. We need a communist international. Part 2. Tasks of the Communist Party. The proletariat can only free itself from the capitalist exploitation if it fights under a revolutionary political organ, the Communist Party. 2. The chief aspect of the political struggle in the Marxist sense is the civil war and the armed uprising by which a class overthrows the power of the opposed dominant class and sets up its own power. Such a struggle can only succeed if it is led by the party organization. 3. Neither the struggle against the power of the exploiting classes nor the successive uprooting of the capitalist economic structures can be achieved without the political revolutionary party. Proletarian dictatorship is indispensable all along the historical period where such tremendous changes will take place and be exercised openly by the party. 4. The party defends and propagates the theory of the movement for the socialist revolution. It defends and strengthens its inner organization by propagating the communist theory and program, by being constantly active in the ranks of the proletariat wherever the latter is forced to fight for its economic interests. Such are its tasks before, during, and after the struggle of the armed proletariat for state power. Okay, we'll add that. That seems pretty clear. 5. The party is not made up of all members of the proletariat or even its majority. It is the organization of the minority, which has collectively reached and mastered revolutionary tactics and theory and practice. In other words, which sees clearly the general objectives of the historic movement, the proletariat, and the whole world, for the whole the historical course which separates the period of its formation from that of its final victory. The party is not formed on the basis of individual consciousness. Not only is it not only is it not possible for each proletarian to become conscious and less so to master the entire class doctrine in a cultural way, but neither is it possible for each individual militant, not even for the leaders of the party. Consciousness consists in the organic unity of the party alone, basically through collective knowledge by all the different people within the in the party. That's where that's where this full consciousness comes from. Continuing, in the same way, therefore, we reject notions based on individual acts or even on mass action when not linked to the party framework. So we must reject any conception of the party as a group of enlightened scholars or conscious individuals. They would term this voluntarism. On the contrary, the party is the organic tissue whose function inside the working class is to carry out its revolutionary task in all its aspects and in all complex stages. Okay. Doing a little spacing because we didn't have it. Continuing. 6. Marxism has always energetically rejected the theory which proposes to the proletariat only trade, industrial, or factory associations. Theory which considers these associations can, by themselves, lead the class struggle to its historical end, the conquest of power and the transformation of society. Incapable of facing the immense task of the social revolution on its own, the Union is, however, indispensable to mobilize the proletariat on a political and revolutionary level. This, however, is possible only if the Communist Party is present and its influence inside the Union grows. The party can only work inside entirely proletarian unions, where membership is voluntary and where no given political, religious, or social opinions are forced upon members. This is not the case with confessional unions, with those where membership is compulsory, with those who have become an integrant part of the state system. Okay. So it sounds like that they would be in favor of America's, I believe it's right to work states, wherein unions are unable to compel all members of the business to join the union, which is actually a necessary thing for unions to have any success, because if they don't, then the workers won't bother to join the union. They'll just get the benefits, and essentially it just stars the union out of people joining them for their immediate interests. So I don't think that I agree with this conception. In fact, I think I strictly disagree because I've seen very directly the results of lack of compulsory union entrance. It spells the death of unions, just flat out. They barely get by. Okay. Well, let's continue. 7. The party will never set up economic associations that exclude those workers who do not accept its principles and leadership. But the party recognizes without any reserve that not only the situation which precedes insurrectional struggle, but also all of the phases of substantial growth of party influence amongst the masses cannot arise without the expansion between the party and the working class of a series of organizations with short term economic objectives with a large number of participants. Within such organizations, the party will set a network of communist cells and groups, as well as communist fraction in the union. In periods when the working class is passive, the party must anticipate the forms and promote the constitution of organizations with immediate economic aims. These may be unions grouped according to trade, industry, factory committees, or any other known grouping, or even quite new organizations. The party always encourages organizations which favor contact between workers at different localities and different trades and their common action. Rejects all forms of closed organizations. Only it gets to be closed. Okay. All right. So the party helps develop economic associations to accept its principles and leadership. Within economic associations that do not, it will build a network of communist cells, groups, and fractions within these associations to take over them from within. These must be pushed to interconnect closer with all other economic associations, and they cannot be allowed to be closed. All right, back to the text. 8. In any situation, the party refuses at the same time the idealist and utopian outlook which makes social transformation dependent on a circle of, quote, elected apostles and heroes. The libertarian outlook which makes it dependent on the revolt of individuals or unorganized masses. The trade union or economist's outlook which entrusts it to apolitical organizations, whether they preach the use of violence or not. The voluntarist and sectarian outlook which does not recognize that class rebellion rises out of a series of collective actions, well prior to a clear theoretical consciousness, and even to resolute will action, and which as a result recommends the forming of a small, quote, elite, isolated from the working class trade unions, or which comes to the same, leaning on trade unions which exclude non-communists. This last mistake, which has been historically characterized the German KPD and Dutch tribunists, the members of the Communist Workers' Party of Deutschland of Germany, KPD in Germany, and of the Dutch group of Tribune Review, led by Gorder and Pankek, that definitely abandoned the Communist International in 1921, has always been fought against by the Marxist Italian left. The differences for reasons of strategy and tactics, which led our current to break away from the Third International, cannot be discussed without reference to the different historical phases of the proletarian movement. Oh boy, we're gonna get into their reasonings. Okay. I don't think we need any of this here. All right, so part 3, historical waves of opportunist degeneration. 1. It is impossible, unless you want to give way to idealism or to mysticism, ethical or aesthetical considerations which are in complete opposition to Marxism, to assert that in all historical phases of the proletarian movement the same intransigence is necessary, that any alliance, any united front, all compromise is to be refused on principle. Quite the contrary. It is only on a historical basis that questions of class and party strategy and tactics can be solved. For this reason, it is the development of the proletarian class throughout the world between the bourgeoisie and the socialist revolutions which must be considered, and not particularities of time and place that nourish casuistry politics. That would be clever but unsound reasoning, especially in relation to moral questions. Okay, sophistry. And there's sophist politics, and which leave practical questions to the whim of groups or steering committees. All right, the party should seek alliance in certain conditions. These conditions are informed on a historical basis, which in turn shows party strategy and tactics. Development of the international proletariat between the bourgeois and socialist revolutions needs to be focused on. You know, this is in direct. This is directly in the front of the previous reading, which, well, this one appealed to movement international reorganization, which categorically refused all attempts at the United Front on grounds of 30 years of failure, despite it working many times over. So perhaps they improved that position And perhaps a 1993 repetition of all that as completely correct, you know, just didn't properly say that they recanted that position. We'll see. Continuing. 2. The proletariat itself is above all the products of capitalist economy and industrialization. Like communism, it cannot be born of the inspiration of individuals, brotherhoods, or political clubs, but only of the struggle of the proletarians themselves. In the same way, the irrevocable victory of capitalism over the forms which have preceded it historically, that is the victory of the bourgeoisie over the feudal and landowning aristocracy and over the other classes characteristic of the old regime, be it Asiatic or European or of other continents, is a condition for communism. At the time of the Communist Manifesto, modern industrial development was still at its beginning and present only in very few countries. In order to speed up the explosion of modern class struggle, the proletariat had to be encouraged to struggle armed at the sides of the revolutionary bourgeoisies during the anti-feudal insurrections or those of national liberation. Okay, this is fair. But no, you're not struggling at the side of in support of them. You're supposed to be struggling in the support of the proletariat, in a temporary united front, wherein you're going to betray the the bourgeoisie after they after you get your victory, and then you're going to take power for yourself. That's how Lenin did it. Anyway, in this way, the workers' participation in the Great French Revolution and its defense against the European coalitions brought up to Napoleonic times is part of the history of the workers' struggle, and in spite of the fact that from the very beginning the bourgeois dictatorship ferociously quelled the first communist-inspired social struggles. Because of the defeat of the bourgeois revolutions of 1848, the strategy of alliance between proletarian bourgeoisie against the classes of the old regime failed in the eyes of Marxists, until in 1871, in view of the fact that this feudal regime still persists in Russia, in Austria and Germany, and that the national unity of Italy, Germany, and the East European countries is a necessary condition of Europe's industrial development. 3. 1871 is a clear turning point in history. The struggle against Napoleon III and his dictatorship is in fact directed against capitalistic and not a feudal form. It is at the same time the period, product, and proof of the mobilization of two fundamental and enemy classes of modern society. Although it sees in Napoleon an obstacle to the bourgeois development of Germany, revolutionary Marxism goes immediately on the side of the anti-bourgeois struggle, which will be that of all parties of the Commune, first workers' dictatorship in history. After this state, the proletariat can no longer choose between contending parties or national armies, insofar as any restoration of pre-bourgeois forms has become socially impossible in two big areas: Europe to confine to the Ottoman and Tsarist empires on the one hand, England and North America on the other. A. Opportunism at the end of the 19th century. 4. If we disregard Bakuninism during the First International and Sorrelism during the Second, as they have nothing to do with Marxism, the social democratic revisionism represents the first opportunist wave within the proletarian Marxist movement. Its vision was the following. Once victory by the bourgeoisie over the old regime was universally secured, the historical phase without insurrections and without wars opens up before humanity. Socialism becomes possible by gradual evolution without violence on the basis of the extension of modern industry and due to numerical increase of workers armed with universal suffrage. In this way, it was tried, Bernstein, to empty Marxism of its revolutionary contents, pretending that its rebellious spirit was inherited from the revolutionary bourgeoisie and not belonging to the proletarian class in itself. At this time, the tactical question of alliance between advanced bourgeois parties and the proletarian party takes on a different aspect to that of the preceding phase. It is no longer a question of helping capitalism to win, but to make socialism derive from it with the help of laws and reform, no longer to file on the barricades of the towns and the country against menaces of restoration, but only to vote together in parliamentary assemblies. That is why the proposals of alliances and coalition and even the acceptance of ministerial posts by workers' representatives is from them on a deviation from the revolutionary path. That is also why radical Marxists reprove all electoral coalition. Uh, let's see. We're going to take this. Right. So reformist electoral demands abandon the class role regardless of their intentions now. Therefore, electoral coalitions are abandoned by revolutionary communists. All right. So B, opportunism 1914. 5. The second tremendous opportunist waves hit the proletarian movement when war breaks out in 1914. Most of the parliamentary and trade union leaders, as well as strong militant groups, and in some countries, whole parties present the conflict between national states as a struggle, which might bring back the absolutism of the feudal system, which might lead to the destruction of the conquest of the bourgeois civilization and even a modern productive system. They preach solidarity with the national state at war, the result of which is an alliance between Tsarist Russia and the advanced bourgeoisies of France and England. The majority of the Second International, therefore, falls into war opportunism from which very few parties, one of which is the Italian Socialist Party, escape. Worse, only advanced groups and factions accept the position of Lenin, who, having defined the war as being a product of capitalism and not a conflict between the latter and less advanced social forms, draws the conclusion that the quote holy union must be condemned and that the proletarian party should practice a defeatist revolutionary policy within each country against the belligerent state and army. Yeah, against the belligerent state and army. In other words, if you are actually fighting a defensive war, for example, a little something called the Soviet Union against the rabidly violent, genocidal, settler colonial Lebensraum, Nazi Germany, is not actually a belligerent. God, so weird that people pick up this shit. Okay, so communists need to practice revolutionary defeatism against belligerent states and armies against their own nation's imperialism. Um, okay, 6. The Third International arises on the basis that it is both anti-social democratic and anti-social patriotic. Not only throughout the whole of the Proletarian International are no alliances entered into with other parties to wield parliamentary power. More than that, it is denied that power can be conquered, even in a quote intransigent way, just by the Proletarian Party through legal means. The need is reasserted amidst the ruins of capitalism's peaceful phase for armed violence and dictatorship. Not only are no alliances entered into with governments at war, even in the case of defensive wars, quote unquote, and class opposition kept up even during war. More than that, every effort is made by means of defeatist propaganda at the front to turn imperialistic war between states into civil war between classes. Okay, we'll take this. Alright, so turn imperialist economic war into political civil war. No alliance with governments at war, even when the imperialists declare that they are defending themselves. 7. The response to the first wave of opportunism was a formula: no electoral, parliamentary, or ministerial alliances to attain reforms. The response to the second wave was another tactical formula: no war alliances since 1871 with the state and bourgeoisie. Delayed reactions would prevent the critical turning point 1914 to 18 being turned to advantage by engaging in the wide-scale struggle for defeatism and war for the destruction of the bourgeois state. 8. One great exception is the victory of Russia in October 1917. Russia was the only major European state still ruled by a feudal power where penetration by capitalist forms of production was weak. In Russia, there is a party, not large, but with a tradition firmly anchored in Marxism, which had not only opposed the two consecutive waves of opportunism in the Second International, but which at the same time, after the Great Trials of 1905, was up to posing the problems of how to graft two revolutions, the bourgeois and the proletarian, together. In February 1917, this party struggles along. It wasn't actually February. This party struggles alongside others against Tsarism, then immediately afterwards not only against the bourgeois liberal parties, but also against the opportunist proletarian parties, and it defeats them all. What is more, it then becomes the center of the reconstitution for the Revolutionary International. 9. The effect of this formidable event is to be found in irrevocable historical results. In the last European country placed outside of the geopolitical area of the West, an uninterrupted fight leads to a proletariat whose social development is far from being complete to power. Liberal democratic forms of the Western type set up in the first phase of the revolutions are brushed aside, and the proletarian dictatorship faces the immense task of accelerating economic development. This means that the still present feudal forms must be overthrown and that the recent capitalist forms must be overcome. The realization of this task calls above all for the victory over the gangs of counter-revolutionary insurgents and the intervention of foreign capitalism. It calls not only for the mobilization of the world proletariat for the defense of Soviet power and to direct the assault on the Western bourgeois powers, but for the extension of the revolutionary struggle to continents inhabited by colored people. In short, the mobilization of all forces able to carry on an armed fight against white capitalist metropolis. Okay, and not necessary currently. 10. In Europe, American strategical alliance with left bourgeois movements against feudal forms of power is no longer possible, and has given way to direct struggle by the proletariat for power. But in underdeveloped countries, the rising proletarian and communist parties will not disdain to participate to insurrections of other anti-feudal classes either against local despotic dominations or against the white colonizers. In Lenin's time, there are two historical alternatives. Either the world struggle ends in victory, that is by the downfall of capitalist power, at least in large parts of advanced part of Europe. This would permit the Russian economy to be transformed at a fast rhythm, quote, jumping the capitalist stage and quickly catching up with Western industry already ripe for socialism, or the big imperial centers stay put, and in this case the Russian revolutionary power is forced to restrain itself to the economic task of the bourgeois revolution, making the effort of immense productive development, but also a capitalist, not a socialist character. So let's actually, yes. So call for decolonization, national liberation, etc. Support for armed resistance by all forces able to fight against white capitalist metropolis. And then voluntary. Okay. All right, no. Yeah, we're good. Continuing. 11. Evidence of the pressing need to accelerate the taking of power in Europe to prevent the violent collapse of the Soviet state or else its involution into a capitalist state in a few years at the very most appeared as soon as bourgeois society consolidated after the serious shock of the First World War. But the Communist parties didn't manage to take power except in a few attempts which were rapidly crushed. And this led them to ask themselves what they could do to counter the fact that large sections of the proletariat were still prey to social democrat and opportunist influences. There are two conflicting methods. The one which considered the parties of the Second International, which are openly conducting an unremitting struggle both against the Communist program and against revolutionary Russia as open enemies, and struggled against them as the most dangerous part of the bourgeois front, and the other, which relied on expedients to reduce the influence of the Social Democratic parties over the masses to the advantage of the Communist Party, using strategic and tactical quote unquote maneuvers. 12. To justify the latter method, the experience of the Bolshevik Party in Russia were misapplied, departing from the correct historical line. The offer of alliances with petit bourgeois or even bourgeois parties was justified historically by the fact that the Tsar's power, by banning all of these movements, forced them to engage in insurrectional struggle. In Europe, on the other hand, the only common actions which were proposed even as a maneuver were ones respectful of legality, whether within the trade unions or within parliament. In Russia, the phase of liberal parliamentarism had been very short, in 1905 and a few months in 1917. It was the same as far as legal recognition of the trade union movement was concerned. In the rest of Europe, meanwhile, half a century of degeneration of the proletarian movement had made these two fields of action propitious terrain on which to dull revolutionary energies and corrupt the workers' leaders. The guarantee which lay in the Bolshevik Party's solidity of organization principle was not the same as the guarantee offered by the existence of state power in Moscow, which, due to social conditions and international relations, was more reliable, as history showed, to succumb to renunciation of revolutionary principles and policies. Because the party was made illegal in Russia, required insurrection. Elsewhere, the party was, according to this, implicitly not made illegal, and they respected legality. In truth, though, communist parties were banned basically everywhere in America and beyond. And members were arrested and so on and so forth. I mean, we had the Red Scare, the multiple Red Scares for that matter. And it was illegal to be part of the Communist Party at other times and so on and so forth. It's not uncommon for Communist parties to be made illegal, and I'm not sure exactly what they're trying to say here. It's true that the Tsar was, of course, Bloody Nicholas, right? And he would torture. He would have people tortured for their political engagements. He had tons of secret police and whatnot. So it's really that. It's not the fact that they were made illegal. It was the conditions in which they were made illegal that forced this. Anyway. 13. The left of the International, to which a great majority of the Communist Party of Italy belonged before it was more or less destroyed by the fascist counter-revolution, which was favored chiefly by a mistake of historical strategy, upheld that in the West all alliances or proposals of alliances with socialist or petit bourgeois parties should be refused at all costs. In other words, there should be no united political front. Admitted that communists should widen their influence within the masses by taking part in all local and economic struggles, calling on the workers of all organizations and all faiths to develop them to a maximum, but refused that the party's action should be subordinated to that of political committees of fronts, coalitions, or alliances. I don't think that anybody had ever at any point called for that. But anyway, even if the subordination was to restrict itself to public declarations and be compensated by internal instructions of militants or the party by subjective intentions of the leaders. Even more strongly, it rejected the so-called quote-unquote Bolshevik tactics, and it took the shape of, quote, workers' government. That is the launching of the slogan, become in some instances a practical experiment with ruinous consequences, of coming into the parliamentary power with mixed majorities of communists and socialists of the various shapes. The Bolshevik Party could draw up no danger of the plan to provisional governments of several parties in the revolutionary phase, and if that allowed it to go to first autonomy of action, and even to outlaw the former allies, all that was made possible only by the diversity of situation of the historical forces, urgent need of two revolutions, and destructive attitude by the state in force towards any coming to power through parliamentary way. It would have been absurd to transpose such a strategy to a situation in which the bourgeois state has had a half a century old democratic tradition and parties that accept its constitutionalism. Okay. We're going to add this bit. I might do a dot dot. Bullshit. All right, so United Front is rejected insofar as it reduces the party's independence, but the party still takes part in all local and economic struggles. 14. Between 1921 and 26, increasingly opportunist versions of the International's tactical method were imposed at its congresses, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and at the enlarged Executive Committee in 1926. At the root of the method was the simple formula: alter the tactics to fit the circumstances. By means of so-called analysis, every 6 months or so, new stages of capitalism were identified and new maneuvers proposed to address them. This is essentially new tactics are revisionist. I hate how loose they are with their definition of tactics. This is just indicative of the larger problem here. What does this even mean? Are your tactics not supposed to be in response at all times to the conditions that you're in? Do you mean your tactics or do you mean your principles? If your principles are shifting, then that's revisionism. If your tactics are shifting in response to things that are going on currently, then that's completely different. If I'm a soldier and my commander keeps having me do the exact same fucking tactic over and over and over again, the same maneuver, that happened in World War One. This infamous shit where you had charges into machine gun fire. They just kept doing it because they hadn't updated their tactics and whatnot, and it was just slaughtering everybody. You want to know what the results of that are? People think, "Fuck this," right? I mean, millions died from this sort of thing. What is it saying that changing your tactics is essentially revisionism? What's this on? Again, if you mean principles, say principles. If you mean the ways in which you come to the conclusion on the tactics and the results of the tactics, can result in revisionism by all means. But simply the development and altering of tactics to fit the circumstances is in no way revisionism. Absolutely ridiculous. Anyway, let's just continue. In other words, when it realized its predictions about the advent of socialism had come true, it decided to force the pace of history with a new praxis. But in doing so, it ceased to struggle for the proletarian and socialist objectives of our maximum program. Back in 1900, the reformists said that the circumstances ruled out all possibility of insurrection. You shouldn't expect the impossible, they said. Let us work instead to win elections and to change the law and to make economic gains via the trade unions. And when this method let us work failed, it provoked a reaction from the essentially voluntarist anarcho-syndicalist current, who blamed party policies, politics, and policies in general. Blame party politics and politics in general, predicting that the change would come through the effort of bold minorities in a general strike, led by the trade unions alone. Similarly, the Communist International, once it saw a West European proletariat wasn't going to fight for the dictatorship, preferred to rely on substitutes as a way of getting through the impasse. And what came of all this, once capitalist equilibrium had been restored, was that it neither modified the objective situation nor the balance of power, but did weaken and corrupt the workers' movement, just as had happened when the impatient revisionists of right and left and up into service of the bourgeoisie and the war coalitions. All theoretical preparation and restoration of revolutionary principles was sabotaged by confusing the kind's program of taking power by revolutionary means with the accession of so-called, quote, kindred governments by means of support and participation in parliament and bourgeois cabinets by communists. In Saxony and Thuringia, it would end in farce, for two policemen were enough to overthrow the government's communist leader. Okay, in this case, they mean principles, not tactics. They mean strategy. Maybe. No, no, this is outside of strategy. This is principles. Because your principles should be part of informing tactics. They should go in and say, okay, we don't engage in electoralism for this, and this reason. And if your tactics are adopted, which go in contrary to that, then that doesn't mean that it's because you're changing your tactics. It means because you're abandoning your principles. That happens before you change your tactics. Make no mistake about that. Um, and with that understanding, this makes more sense. It's just that they're super loose and consider everything tactics, including, for example, your organizational structure, which then they also go in and say doesn't actually exist and whatnot, which is absolutely no. But let's see. Yeah, what would be taken from this would be don't do revisionism and keep to your principles, which I don't think needs to be written down here. Continuing. 15. Internal organization was subjected to similar confusion, and the difficult task of sorting out revolutionary members from opportunist ones in the various parties and countries would be compromised. It is believed that new party members more amenable to cooperating with the center could be procured by wrestling away entire left wings of the old social democratic parties. Whereas, in fact, once the new international had gone through its initial period of formation, it had to function permanently as a worker world party and only have new converts joining its national sections on an individual basis. Wanting to win over large groups of workers, deals were struck instead with the leaders and the movement's cadres were thrown into disorder and dissolved and recombined during periods of active struggle. Recognizing fractions and groups within the opportunist parties as, quote, communist, they would be absorbed by means of organizational mergers. Thus, almost all of the parties, instead of preparing for the struggle, were kept in a state of permanent crisis, lacking continuity of action and with no clear boundary set between friend and foe. It would register one failure after another and on an international scale. The left lays claim to organizational unicity and continuity. The overthrow of the structure of the parties under the pretext of, quote, Bolshevization was another reason for the left to defer from the leadership of the International. The territorial organization of the party was changed for a network of factory cells. This narrowed the political horizon of the members who had the same trade and therefore the same immediate economic interests. In this way, the natural synthesis of the different social impulsions which would have helped to make the struggle a general one, gone to all categories, was not achieved. As this synthesis was lacking, the only factor of unity was represented by top executives whose members became in this way officials with all negative characteristics of the old socialist party system. So this is stuff that we had read previously, and can't remember the piece, but um, it's essentially with Bolshevization, they're trying to say, okay, I want you to apply the same organizational structure from the Bolsheviks over to here, and it didn't work out. Continuing. The criticism which the Italian Marxist left made of this organization must not be mistaken as claiming to return to, quote, internal democracy and to, quote, free election of the party leaders. It is neither internal democracy nor free elections which give the party its nature of being the most conscious fraction of the proletariat and its function at revolutionary guide. It is instead the matter of deep discrepancy of conceptions about deterministic organicity of the party as a historical body, living in the reality of the class struggle. It is a fundamental deviation in principles and made the parties unable to foresee and face the opportunist danger. Basically, rather than letting the party spontaneously develop, they would argue that's not spontaneous because the whole reversal praxis or whatever, because they're guided by theory. Um, Effectively, the results are because obviously nobody but the party is guided by theory. And therefore, no, it's silly shit. Anyway, essentially because they weren't able to go through this period of splits and kicking out the various incorrect factions, and instead were kind of forced to play nice with people who were not of the correct line. It constantly led to internal conflict that was suppressed rather than properly dealt with. And the result was that this was effectively zombie organizations. I'm sure you've seen them where everybody within an organization has a different idea about how it should be carried out, and but they're kind of forced to follow a particular line that none of them actually really agree with. Just like a business company, you know. And that thing can function, it doesn't function very well. This sort of thing would be resolved by a proper organizational structure, um, which they seem to claim will arise organically out of the struggle internal, rather than applying lessons from the past and constructing an organization that is coherent and utilizing historical knowledge to say, okay, we're going to do this, this, and this, rather than adopt for our material conditions. Problem isn't, you know, the adoption of an organizational structure. Problem is adopting a foreign organizational structure, right? Anyway, continuing. 16. Analogous, especially a foreign organizational structure that demanded all of them maintain that structure without changes after it was established, even when people were having issues within it. That is a failure of organizational structure, a very specific kind, and it's actually quite regular. And there's ways to deal with that. Anyway, 16. Analogous deviations took place in Russia, where, for the first time in history, the difficult problem of organization and internal discipline of the Communist Party, which had come to power and whose membership had enormously increased, arose. The difficulties met in the internal social struggle for a new economy and revolutionary political struggle outside of Russia provoked contrasting opinions between Bolsheviks of the old guard and new members. The party's leading group had in its hands not only the party apparatus, but also the whole state apparatus. Its opinions, or those of the majority within it, were made good not by means of party doctrine and its national and international tradition of struggle, but by repression of the opposition by means of the state apparatus and by strangling the party in a police-like manner. This is what we read about with Trotsky's A New Course. And also whatever that piece is that prompted me to add that to reading list. Continuing. All disobedience towards the central organ of the party was judged as a counter-revolutionary act warranting, besides expulsion, punitive sanctions. The relationship between the party and the state was thus completely distorted, and the group which controlled both was thus able to enforce a series of surrenders of principles and of the historical line of the party and world revolutionary movement. In reality, the party is a unitary organism in its doctrine and action. To join the party imposes preemptory obligation on leaders and followers. But joining and leaving is voluntary without any kind of physical compulsion and shall so before, during, and after the conquest of power. That's impossible. That is impossible. The physical compulsion is embedded as soon as it gains power and hegemony. So this right here is just something that you're going to have to deal with as a reality. I don't know how it is that they think that one cannot have physical consequences for not being in the party, for being expelled from it, or from being bullied out, or having to leave, or any other way that occurs. You're going to have social consequences. Why were you kicked out of the party? Why did you feel like you need to leave the party? Oh, it's because you disagreed, but the party was right, wasn't it? There's all sorts of reasons why you'd have a compulsion and a direct material interest to be in the party and stay in the party, especially after it's gained hegemony, which it will, especially in a state that is supposedly, marrying the state and the party in one. It's ridiculous to think otherwise. Anyway, the party directs alone and autonomous way to struggle of the exploited class to destroy the capitalist state. In the same way, the party, alone and autonomous, leads the revolutionary proletarian state. And just because the state is historically a transitory organ, legal intervention against party members or groups is a pointer to a serious crisis. As soon as such intervention becomes a practice in Russia, the party became crowded with opportunistic members who sought nothing more than to procure advantages for themselves or at least to benefit from the protection of the party. If they were accepted without hesitation, and instead of weakening the state, there's a dangerous inflation of the party in power. Alright, let's just add this a little bit. The party alone directs alone in an autonomous way the struggle of the exploited class to destroy the capitalist state. In the same way, the party, alone and autonomous, leads the revolutionary proletarian state. And just because the state is historically a transitory organ, legal intervention against party members or groups. Oh, I'm sorry. No, we got to the end of that section. The party's unitarian doctrine and action. Leaders and, quote, followers in the party have discipline and obligation simply by having membership. The party should not have compulsory, either physically or socially, participation. Could be and can be are two different things. Anyway, in fact, this reversal of influences resulted in the opportunists getting an upper hand on the orthodox. The betrayers of revolutionary principles paralyzed, immobilized, accused, and finally condemned those who defended them in a coherent way, some of whom had understood too late that the party would never again become a revolutionary one. In fact, it was the government at grips with the hard reality of internal and external affairs which solved questions and imposed its solutions on the party. The latter, in turn, had an easy time in international congresses to impose these solutions on the other parties, which dominated and handled it as it liked. In this way, the directive of the Comintern line became more and more eclectic and conciliatory with respect to world capitalism. The Italian left never questioned the revolutionary merits of the party which had led the first proletarian revolution to victory, but maintained that the contributions of the party still openly struggled against their bourgeois regime were indispensable. The hierarchy which could solve the problems of revolutionary action in the world and in Russia must therefore be the following: the International of the World Communist Parties, its various sections, including the Russian one; finally, the Communist government for internal Russian politics, but exclusively along party lines. Otherwise, the internationalist character of the movement and its revolutionary efficiency could not but become compromised. Only by respecting this rule could a divergence of interests and objectives between the Russian state and world revolution be avoided. Lenin himself had many times admitted that if the revolution broke out in Europe or the world, the Russian party would take not second, but at least fourth place in the general political and social leadership of the Communist Revolution. Welcome to another Human Read audiobook by the United Marxist Pact Discord server, link below in the description. In this series, we continue our investigation into the initial construction, the organizational structure, and the principles and tactics of the form of worker organization capable of seizing political power and establishing the revolutionary proletarian dictatorship and communality, which can in turn produce a communist mode of production through the shared class interests of the workers of the entire world. Our goal is to compile, analyze, and elaborate on what all these texts have to say about this. At the end, have a strong understanding of the exact scientific process of it, particularly in general terms. At the end of our readings as a whole, we will try to put it all together and present it as a coherent whole in an educational video with associated notations. Today's reading will be the 1951 ICP Characteristic Theses of the Party. We have a pre-written textual analysis on the terms of the aforementioned topics, which was also posted in the pinned comment if you prefer to read it in text, or follow the link in the description to a read-only version of my Google Docs notes. This will summarize the contents of the text, but is no replacement for the actual reading itself for the sake of understanding the context and content of the piece. In addition, in the reading, I supply my own commentary, critiques, additions, etc., which may be helpful for understanding some particularities. And I do not actually write down things that are repetitious or I feel are completely inapplicable. So let's get right into the textual analysis from my point of view. The class party is made up of the most advanced and resolute parts of the proletariat which arise from the development of theory and class struggle, who then seek to maintain and make predictions from that theory in order to educate and unite the masses' individual interests into a general struggle. Through preparations, it gathers the material means, weapons, supply, etc., for action, experience, and leads the working class as its general staff while creating international unity of the communist movement. It's all stuff that we have talked about many times before. As time has passed, the bourgeois system has built up its own tactics and methods of resistance against proletarian class struggle and its organizations. The most dangerous form that has arisen has been through recuperation and presentation of options of class collaboration to sections of the proletariat. So this would be fascism, social democracy, national liberation from the wherein, hey, join us and we will become the capitalists in our own nations, right? Therefore, the party needs to struggle directly against people calling for reformism, with even reformist positions rejected for agitational purposes. Reject any alliances with the middle classes or reformist organizations which can only weaken it and the proletariat's positions. It as in the party. In order to carry out its tasks in modern times, the party must transcend national boundaries and become an international party, producing an international. This party must be autonomous and independent from any organized political or military power while defending, developing itself, and educating others about the movement. Its inner organization should be girded by the propagation of the communist theory and program, along with activity alongside the masses struggling for their immediate interests. The party itself is a minority of the working class that has mastered revolutionary tactics in theory and practice, understanding the general objectives of the proletariat and the historical movement internationally. Such a knowledge can never be held by any individual or even a small collection of workers. Rather, the party's general knowledge rests in the whole of its activities. In order to tap into and utilize such knowledge, there needs to be an organic unity of the whole party. It is unitary in doctrine and action, and leaders and followers in the party have discipline and obligations, while the party itself does not have compulsory, either physically or socially, participation. It focuses on the recruitment of revolutionary youth and their education and preparation for political activity, demanding lack of personal ambition or personality cult, while being able to uphold continuity and revolutionary tradition. Under certain circumstances, while the party might not ally with the middle class's organizations, it might seek alliance in other areas. The conditions wherein this occurs are informed on a historical basis, which determines the party's strategy and tactics, but under no circumstances can the party abandon its principles. Functionally, the international proletariat must be developed, and anything that hinders such development of the class struggle is anti-Marxist. Hence, reformist electoral demands of all kinds abandon the class struggle regardless of their intentions, and thereby electoral coalitions are abandoned by revolutionary communists. No bourgeois legality should be respected, and the need for insurrection, even when alternatives are presented by the bourgeoisie and opportunist factions, must be recognized and sought at all times. Despite this, the party still takes part in all local and economic struggles. Any reduction in the independence and autonomy of the party is at all times viciously rejected, including, for example, any configuration of the United Front which calls on the party to make any sort of sacrifice in those terms. In addition, revolutionary communists must always practice revolutionary defeatism if they are within imperialist countries, and turn economic imperialist war into political civil war, refusing alliance with governments at war, even when the imperialists declare they are defending themselves. This must be accompanied by an active fight for decolonialism and national liberation, supporting armed resistances by all forces fighting against uh, colonization and against national liberation, including, for example, with Black Americans fighting white capitalist metropolis. At all times, it seeks to take the offensive and aims to attack for for attack and conquest of political power, staunchly refusing any forms of calls to quote return to previous or new quote better form of capitalism. The party, no matter the circumstances forced by the bourgeoisie in their response to proletarian class struggle, expects no mercy and prepares only for the revolutionary civil war. Any opportunism or gradualism weakens the party's capacity to actually resist when the hammer inevitably comes down. The party at any and all times should reject any calls for peaceful coexistence, propagandizing about the incompatibility among classes and the realities and necessities of class struggle, which makes any form of pacifism impossible. Armed struggle and insurrection should at all times be prepared for. The proletariat and their party must accept this in order to be capable of engaging in class struggle. Any calls for pacifism, while imperialism and the bourgeoisie exist, can only ever be aimed at disarming the proletariat and removing their capacity for revolutionary influence. Hence, the party should maintain the historical line of preparation for resurgence of international class struggle, reject any calls for peaceful coexistence, and prepare theoretically and materially. This requires the integration of all results of past experiences, and while objective and subjective conditions are undeveloped and practical activity are reduced, the final goal, which produces the ability to take advantage of inevitable development of subjective conditions, must always be kept in focus, with tactics employed which reach towards that in a dynamic way. Regardless of objective conditions, the proletariat's doctrine is unchanging because its role in the historical dialect, and therefore the proletariat's movement, should not have any revisions towards principles of any kind of the proletarian revolution. With this historic understanding, the party is able to and should analyze contemporary social phenomena scientifically and use that to prove to the proletariat its correct position. Due to the form of reaction bourgeois society has adopted, that of quote peaceful coexistence and class collaboration, the party's targets must be the opportunist quote communist parties in order to re-centralize the proletariat on the correct line and produce a rigorous Marxist movement. In addition, the party currently lacks links with the masses, and so it should not seek to develop new theories or renovate old ones, as it cannot put them into testing via praxis, and any attempts to do so will only lead to incorrect stances developing atop incorrect stances. The proletariat needs the party to maintain theoretical continuity as the condensation of experiences of past struggles until conditions allow it to take action. In this time, the party aims principally at propaganda explaining the correct political line and principles of revolutionary movement, which should penetrate and place itself among the masses at periods of historical crisis of capital. This penetration, done by attacking the opportunist parties, includes entryism and coalition with those parties or organizations with the pretext of extending our reach. This is good, as our tactics to get the proletariat to listen cannot breach our principles, else it confuses the proletariat and weakens the position of the party, which is only fit to carry out the struggle if it has the correct doctrine and political stance, which thereby precludes expedients that lead to deviation from principle. Attempts for coalition or entryism or committee formation with non-proletarian organizations are, of course, and also obvious fool's errands which only harms the party. However, unlike other political organizations, the party is willing to work with unions and other economic organizations that can be present and grow influence within, which have voluntary membership, non sectarianism in terms of politics, religion, or social opinions, and thereby not exclude all possibilities of autonomous class action, and which are entirely proletarian. The party helps develop economic associations which accept its principles and leadership, and ones that do not. It builds a network of communist cells, groups, and factions within it in an attempt to take them over from within. The party pushes for all such organizations to seek interconnection with all other economic associations and remain fully open. Okay, I will now begin the full audiobook reading. It will explain why I went through that, and I take my notes as I read. So I hope that you will stick around. Let's get started.